Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew and welcome to my latest tutorial where I'm going to be sharing with you how to attach a facing to the neckline of a garment. And we're specifically going to be working with a V neckline. During the tutorial, I'm going to be sharing two different techniques for actually sewing the facing on. And then we're going to be looking at tips for trimming, clipping and grading your seam allowances, as well as understitching and pressing. You're going to need to begin by sewing the garment together so that you can actually attach your facing unit. With the sample that I'm working with here, I needed to sew the shoulders together and press them open. You can also see that I finished the edges of my fabric using an overlocker or serger. However, you're welcome to use pinking shears or the overcast or a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. Now, during this tutorial, I'm going to be sharing with you two examples of how to attach a V-neck facing. And each of the samples is slightly different. This piece here has got a fold down the centre back, or perhaps you had a seam that you had to sew together down the centre back. Therefore, the facing unit is one whole circular piece that you can see here. Now, the facing was cut on the fold for the front and the back. And you can see that I've sewn the shoulders together and finished the edges of the fabric with the overlocker. Now, this is the wrong side of the facing. This is the right side. The difference in colour is because I've added interfacing onto the wrong side of my facing. And I did this after having cut out the pieces of fabric. You're going to want to use an interfacing that works best for your fabric. I used a relatively lightweight interfacing and I generally work with woven interfacings. If you're unsure about the interfacing that you should be using or how to attach it, please follow the link in the description box below to our interfacing tutorial. Another thing that your pattern may ask for you to do is to complete some stay stitching around the neckline of your garment, around the front and the back. What this does is it helps to stabilize the neckline and to prevent it from stretching. Now, stay stitching is a very small stitch length on the sewing machine, 1.5 millimeters, and you want to complete this in the seam allowance but close to your stitching line. My seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters. I chose this because it's what will often be used in commercial sewing patterns, and I wanted it to be easy for you to follow. However, if you're drafting your own pattern, you're welcome to work with less, as I would normally work with less. Therefore, my stay stitching has been completed 1/2 inch, 1.2 centimeters away from the raw edge of the fabric. You're going to want to complete it in the directions indicated on your pattern. An alternative to stay stitching is actually to use strips of iron-on interfacing and to apply these to the wrong side of your fabric at the neckline. You're going to want to make sure that the interfacing is sitting on top of the stitching line that you're going to be working with. Now, this is the other sample that we're going to be working with during this tutorial, and you can see here that the centre back of this sample is actually open. That's because a fastening is going to be attached. Now, it will depend on what that fastening is, whether you need to attach it prior to adding the facing. Please look at your individual sewing pattern for details. Now, because there is a gap at the centre back of my garment, this facing unit also has a gap at the centre back. So, when I was working with this facing unit, I had to cut out one front on the fold and two back pieces. Interfacing is added to the wrong side of the facing unit because it will help create stability, strength and structure and support the garment. It will aid you in creating a perfectly finished, professional looking neckline. Again, with this facing unit, the shoulders have been sewn and all of the edges of the fabric have been finished accordingly. Once your garment and facing units are ready, you're going to turn your garment so that it has the right side facing out. Then you're going to collect your facing unit and you're going to position the right side of the facing unit onto the right side of the garment. You're going to want to start by matching any seams that need to be matched, or edges. On this piece, the facing unit is a complete circle, so there aren't going to be any edges. It's simply the shoulder seams that need to be matched up. Now I want these to be a perfect match, so I'm going to be working with clover fork pins to create a perfect match here. Now I'm going to match the shoulder seam of my facing unit to the shoulder seam of my garment, and I'm going to have to do it manually first. So I'm going to peel it back and check that one is on the top of the other. Holding that firmly, I'm going to take my clover pin and I'm going to position the legs of the pin either side of the seam we're trying to match, in and out through all of the layers. A couple of things to think about here. You need to make sure that the clover pin, the sort of curved edge of it, is sitting up, facing up. You're going to need to make sure that the point of the legs don't pass the edge or the raw edge of the fabric, especially if you're using a seam guide. And make sure that where you position your pin in is at the proximity of your stitching line. It won't work or won't help you if you have the pin too close to the edge or too far away. Once you're happy with its placement, you then want to take a peek between the two layers and check that you've got a match. If you have, we're good to go. Once you've matched any seams together, such as the shoulder seams, you're then going to need to match and pin the rest of the facing onto the garment. Start by matching the point of the V and then work your way up either side and around the back of the neck. You're going to want to match the raw edge of the facing to the raw edge of the garment. If you have a little bit of a discrepancy between the two layers, you're going to want to ease them together. The best way to do this is to pick the middle point of the facing and match this to the middle point of the garment. Position in a pin. You can then work with the middle point between those two pins that you've put in. And if you've got any discrepancy between the layers here, you'll be able to ease it evenly around the neckline. And I would then work with it up here between the pin and the shoulder seam that you've already matched. You're going to want to work your way around the whole of the neckline, doing this, positioning in your pins so that it's ready to sew. The same rules apply for our other sample, where we have an opening at the centre back. Now, how you finish your facing edge here will depend on the fastening that you're adding or have added into the back seam. But most of the time you're going to simply want to match the centre back of the garment to the centre back of the facing. To make sure that you have a really accurate point to your V, I would recommend that you draw your stitching line on. It allows you to know where you need to position the needle into the fabric, lift the presser foot and turn. Now I recommend that you draw it on with chalk or a removable pen. You want to make sure that you measure from the raw edge of your fabric, your stitching line. I'm working with 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimetres. And I'm simply going to draw that on. Now, if your neckline is curved, which mine is ever so slightly curved V, you're going to need to move the ruler with the curve of the neckline. And you're going to want to do that past the point so that we can get a join at the bottom here. Just like so, I have an accurate line to follow. I would recommend that you use something that has quite a sharp line, so either a good quality chalk pen or a sharpened piece of chalk or a nice removable pen that perhaps comes off with air or water would be great for this. Just please test it on your fabric first. Just so that you know, I wouldn't use a chalk pen as dark as this on this colour fabric, but I wanted it to come up nice and clear for you to see. Now I'm going to share with you two different methods for actually sewing the facing onto the garment. Now this is method 1. and it's probably my preferred method that I use most of the time. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to start stitching 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters from the point of the V. So we'll start stitching about here. We will stitch to the point of the V and then along our stitching line up and around to the back of the garment. We'll then complete the other side and we'll start stitching from the point of the V, 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters, and we'll be stitching here on top of the stitching that we did previously, down to the point of the V and back around the other side to the center back. We'll be working with a 2.5mm stitch length. Because we're stitching over ourselves at the point of the V, we'll be making this area secure, as we're going to cut into this area once we finish sewing. You shouldn't have any problem stitching over the clover pins, but just be careful when you go over them with your sewing machine. Now we're going to begin 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters away from the point, and we're sewing towards the point. My machine is set up on a 2.5mm stitch length. I'm starting with my needle in the fabric and I'm on the line that I've drawn. I'm going to do a very small back stitch to secure my stitching, 1 or 2 stitches forwards and 1 or 2 stitches backwards. I'm going to stitch to the point that I have drawn. Now, as you near the point, if you worry that you won't end up with the needle right on the point accurately, then please feel free to use the hand wheel on the side of the sewing machine. If you turn that towards you, you can actually walk your stitches forwards for an accuracy. Now, when I'm happy that my needle is in the bottom of the point, if I want to check that, with the needle in the fabric, I could lift the presser foot and have a look. And yes, that is perfect. If I wasn't happy, I'd put the presser foot back down and sew another stitch, either by using the hand wheel, turning it towards yourself to move forwards, or if you want to go backwards 1 stitch, you can actually turn it backwards and that will lift out the previous stitch of the fabric. Needle in, presser foot up, and you're going to turn the fabric here so that we can start working up the other side. Now we're going to continue stitching on the drawn line, taking the pins out as we go. When I don't have a drawn line anymore, I'm simply going to use the guide on my sewing machine for my 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters, which is the seam allowance that I'm working with. I'm going to work my way up to the shoulder. I'm going to stitch over the clover fork pin, and I'm going to stitch all the way to the center back where I will backstitch and finish sewing. If you struggle with the curve over the shoulder area here, you can by all means draw that on too, to make sure that you have 2 accurate curves the same on both sides of the shoulder. I'm coming to the center back where I'm going to do a back stitch, couple of stitches backwards, couple of stitches forwards, and there we can finish. Now I'm starting 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters from the point of the V on the opposite side. So I'm stitching on top of what I've already stitched. I've trimmed my threads from the previous side to make sure they don't get caught. My needle's in the fabric and I'm going to start with a simple stitch forwards and backwards to secure it, keeping that to a minimum. I'm then going to stitch to the point of the V. And again, if you're worried about missing it, you can use the hand wheel to walk your last stitch or your last few stitches. Make sure that the needle is in the same place. Lift the presser foot if you need to check. If you feel that it's a little bit off, then what you could do, and it's going to be less than a stitch off, then what I would do is lift my foot here. I'd raise the needle and I would then put the needle down ever so carefully on the correct point. Foot down again. That's all good. So now I can raise the foot and turn the fabric. And we're ready to sew up the other side. Now you'll notice here the difficulty with completing this side is that your fabric of the garment has to come this side of the sewing machine. If you have a lot of fabric or a lot of bits to your garment, this may be inconvenient. The other thing that can be difficult, and this depends on your sewing machine, is that you might not have any markings on this side of your metal plate, any guidelines for your stitching line. So what I've done here is to actually draw my stitching line on for this side. Or alternatively, you could use a magnet or a seam guide of some description. We're going to sew all the way up to the other back and back stitch. For sample number 2, I'm going to stitch around the whole of the neckline in a circle. This is something I might do if I have a lot of fabric in my garment. There are a lot of pieces, and perhaps with the first method, I would struggle to sew the second side of my neckline where I have to feed the fabric through the smaller area of the sewing machine. If you're planning on sewing this as one circle, you must make sure that you change your stitch length down at the V to a smaller stitch length of 1.5 millimeters. The rest of the V can be sewn at your standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length, but I would recommend that you turn the stitch length down to 1.5 millimeters, approximately 1 inch, 2.5 millimeters away from the point of the V, and the same the other side. Stitch for 1 inch, 2.5 millimeters at the shorter length, and then you can change your stitching line back up to the standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Now with this sample, I also want to share another tip with you for the bottom of the V. We're going to complete one stitch horizontally. This is something I do if I have quite a thick fabric, and I worry that when I clip and trim and turn this around, that I won't get a very sharp V because the fabric will be too thick and be sort of filling up the area. As a reminder, I tend to use my ruler and the chalk pen to draw a small horizontal line at the bottom of my V. This will help me to remember that I want to complete one stitch horizontally, and it will give me a guideline to do it on. Now for this sample, we're going to be sewing in a circle. You want to start at the centre back, complete a small back stitch, and stitch across the shoulder over the clover pin and down towards the V, which is where I'm on my way to now. I'm working with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length here, taking the pins out as I go and making sure I use my guide here for the seam allowance that I'm working with, which is, in this case, 1.5 centimeters, 5/8 of an inch. Now I'm coming up to my drawn line here, and it should make it easy for me to follow. Now, when you near the point of the V, you're going to want to make sure that you start with a smaller stitch length. When you're about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters away, we're going to turn down to 1.5 millimeter stitch length. And we're going to take that pin out. Now, I'm going to near the point of the V. As I near, I may again need to use the hand wheel to walk my stitches forwards. And I want to end up on that horizontal line. Now we're going to complete 1 or 2 stitches maximum at a 1.5 millimeter length horizontally. So we're going to lift the foot and turn the fabric so that we've got that horizontal line. Now I would recommend that you use the hand wheel here to walk 1 or 2 stitches. Walk 1, lift the foot, have a peek. Is that okay? Oh, hang on, you might need another one. There we go, lift the foot again. Yes, we're spot on. So now we're going to lift the foot and turn so that we can stitch up the other side. Keep stitching at the shorter stitch length until you're about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters away from the point of the V. And then you can turn back to the standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. You're going to keep working your way all the way around until you get back to the centre back where you'll back stitch again. One other thing to mention here is that if you're working with 2 layers of fabric that perhaps you've had to ease together and you've got a little bit of discrepancy as you're sewing, what you're going to need to make certain of is that you sort of use your hands sideways to smooth out any of those creases, to make sure that where the needle is going in, there isn't any puckers or you're not catching any of the fabric. It doesn't matter if there are puckers either side of the needle, just where the needle is going in, you mustn't stitch a pucker or any extra fabric there. Once you're happy with the stitching, it doesn't matter which of the methods that you used. The next process is going to be the same for both methods. The first thing that I'd recommend that you do, trim any threads and just double check that you're happy with everything. One of the little details that I like to double check is that the curves around the shoulder, around the back of the neck, are the same if you haven't drawn them on. I tend to position them together like so. And then you can either gradually peel back one of the layers, or you can use a pin and you can actually put a pin through and check that you've stitched in the same place. And I would do this for this sort of curve at the back neck because you don't want that to be different, and you're better off, if it is not correct, to remove your stitching now and to redo it. The same with the front of the V. If you're unhappy with anything, I would recommend that you redo it now prior to continuing. The first thing that we're going to do is to cut. We're going to cut into the front of the V here, really close to the stitching. We don't want to cut through it, but we want to cut very, very close. Take a small, sharp pair of scissors and position a cut right in the center of the V to the stitching. And as I said, you don't want to cut through the stitching, but you want to cut very close. The next step is to press the seam allowances of the facing and the garment open, all the way around the neckline, right into the V there. This will give you a really professional finish once we've finished with the neckline. As you can see, I've pressed the seam allowances open all the way around the neckline. The next step is to decide whether you need to trim or grade your seam allowances and clip them. It will depend on the fabric that you're working with and the seam allowances that you have used, how much you need to trim and or grade. Firstly, have a feel. Fold your facing towards the inside of the garment and you'll be able to feel the seam allowances here. Are they too bulky? Do you need to trim them down? If so, by how much? Do you need to grade them? The word grading basically means that we're going to stagger them so that you don't have two seam allowances the same width and therefore the bulk at the same width. So for this tutorial, I'm going to share with you how to actually trim and grade so that you know what to do if your fabric requires it. Now, the most important rule when grading is that when this is finished, the facing goes on the inside. The seam allowance that's closest the outside of your fabric here must be the largest. Otherwise, if you had more than 2 seam allowances, you would see the staggers that you had cut in. So the seam allowance closest to the front must be the largest. And that is the seam allowance of the body of the garment. So for this tutorial, we're going to trim the facing seam allowance to about 1/8 3mm and the body seam allowance to 1/4 inch 5mm. I'm going to take a sharp pair of scissors and I'm simply going to work my way around, trimming the seam allowance as neatly as I can. And I'm starting with the facing, so I'm working with that 1/8 3mm. Now this is probably the most drastic amount of trimming and grading that you would need to do, but I'd rather show you what you would need to do on perhaps a thicker fabric, and then you can see what feels and works best for the fabric that you're working with. You can always do a little sample if you need to. So there you can see I've trimmed that down, and that's actually quite small what we're aiming for there. Now I've trimmed the facing to 1/8 3mm, and I'm going to trim the garment fabric to 1/4 inch 5mm. And I'm going to do that all the way around over the shoulder seam and round to the centre back. And you should be able to see on this side here the difference. So the facing seam allowance is smaller than the body seam allowance. Now you will probably need to clip into the seam allowances, whether you grade or trim them or not, to make sure that you sort of release them and allow the facing to be turned under, and it will stop it from pulling or being tight around the neck. Now this is what would be a concave curve. Everywhere around this neckline would be a concave curve. And when you're working with concave curves, you actually only need to snip into the fabric. One singular snip in. You don't need to cut out a V. Now, you're going to want to do that around the places where there is a curve. You can see at the back neck here that this could be a troubled area. So I'm going to do a few more in the areas that are troubled than in the areas that aren't. Now, my personal opinion of this is that I don't cut through both seam allowances at the same point. I believe that creates an area of weakness because you're cutting through to the stitching line. So I stagger them. I will cut through one seam allowance and then I'll cut through the other seam allowance and make sure that the point of weakness or the cut isn't at the same point. And then I'll do a few clips down the front as well. And you may also find that at the front V here, you have a little bit of a right angle of fabric and you may need to remove that. It depends on how thick your fabric is, but you may find if you've got a very thick fabric that that would just sit there and cause bulk at the front of the V too. Once you've clipped, graded, trimmed, whatever you're planning on doing to your seam allowances, you can then start to sort of roll the facing around and just get a feel for it. Check that you don't need to clip any other places, that you don't need to trim your seam allowances down anymore, and that you feel it's going to sit well. Once you're happy with that, we're then going to move on to some understitching. Now, understitching is something that you do around generally the neckline of garments. You do it to facings, you can do it to lining areas, and what it does is it holds the facing or the lining to the wrong side against your body, to the wrong side of the fabric and out of view. So for this particular neckline, we are going to be understitching on our facing. You always want to do this on the facing, so we're not going to see this from the front of the garment. When we stitch on the facing, we want to be about 3 millimeters, 1/8 of an inch away from the seam that join the facing to the garment. So it's going to be quite close, which will look neat and professional. When you stitch on the facing, you also want to make sure that you catch all of those seam allowances. So you're going to want to keep pulling them towards the facing as you do this. So my right hand's underneath and I'm feeling that all those seam allowances are there underneath the facing. You're more than welcome to put some pins in if you feel that would help you. Now we're going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to share with you how we do this. To complete the understitching, I'm going to be stitching 1/8, 3 millimeters from the seam that you can see here that joined the facing to the garment. So we're stitching on the facing, we're catching all of the seam allowances, they're being pushed towards the facing. Now if you're working with the garment that didn't have a gap at the centre back, you're going to be completing this as a circle. That's not a problem. Start at the centre back, backstitch to secure your stitching, work all the way around, and then backstitch when you get back around your circle. Now I'm working with a sample that has a gap at the centre back. A fastening of some description is going to be introduced here. Now it will depend on the fastening that you're applying, whether the fastening needs to be introduced prior to understitching. I recommend that you check your individual pattern instructions. You may also want to take note whether the understitching happens in the seam allowance, because you've still got a seam allowance down this centre back here, or whether you need to start the understitching in, so on the stitching line, mine would be 5/8, 1.5 centimeters in from the edge of the fabric. So I'm going to begin with a little forwards and backwards stitch. I'm working, as I have throughout the tutorial, with a different colour thread, but you'll be working with the thread that matches your fabric, so this will hardly be seen. Now I'm going to keep checking with my right hand here that all the seam allowances are coming towards the facing, and my left hand is feeling on top, making sure that the garment side is flat, there are no seam allowances sitting there. Now the foot that I'm working with comes with the Husqvarna sewing machine that I have. It's got nice little grooves that I can actually line this seam here into, so the seam that joined the facing to the garment, and I've got a little groove there that's exactly 1/8 3 mil away from my stitching line. If you don't have a foot like this, have a little look and see what came with your machine. Sometimes they will have applique feet, or perhaps you could purchase an edge stitching foot or a top stitching foot that would help you. Another option would actually be to change where your needle position is. So find something that you can line up with this and change the needle position so that it makes it easy for you, so that you're following perhaps the edge of the foot with this seam, and the needle is automatically stitching your distance 1/8 3 millimeters away. Now I'm nearing the V here, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because again, making sure all the seam allowances are towards the facing, and you're going to want to go over the sort of center of the V, trying not to catch any puckers of fabric. You're just going to want to take it slow and try and sort of pull the 2 layers of fabric as taut as possible. And as I'm working my way along here, I am sort of pulling ever so slightly on the garment and the facing to make sure that I don't end up with a crease or a fold line along this edge. By pressing it open like we did in the first step, that will help to prevent that, but it's just something you want to look out for. I'm working my way all the way back to the back where I will backstitch again. And when you get to the end, you can backstitch to secure. Just to mention, in case I forgot, I completed all of the understitching with a 2.5 millimeter stitch length. Once you've completed the understitching and you're happy with it, do check that you've caught all of those seam allowances onto the facing. If you haven't, you can always unpick a little section and redo it. Now what we're going to do is to press from the facing side, the facing in position. Now, from the facing side, we want to make sure that we can see a very small amount of the front of the garment. And that's so that from the front of the garment, we can't see any of the facing. You want to literally see about 1/16 to 1/8 maximum, which is between 1 and 3 millimeters of the front of the garment. And we'll do this all the way around the neckline from the facing side. When you get to the V here, make sure that you give it a little bit of a tug just to make sure that that's sitting ever so nicely. And again, you can press that in place. Once you're happy with everything from the facing side, I recommend that you turn it over and have a look at it from the front. You should find that you've got a nice sharp V and that you can't see any of the facing, nor any stitching, because remember the understitching should just be on the facing and through the seam allowances. If you feel you need to, you can give it another press from this front side. Check your fabric though, and please use a pressing cloth or a piece of silk organza if you need to. Hopefully you're happy with how your facing has been attached so far and the understitching that went onto it. The final thing would be to actually anchor your facing down in a couple of places or wherever you potentially can. Now the centre back of the garment, because this one is open, is going to be finished with some kind of fastening. So that will be dependent on the fastening that you're working with. If you were working with the facing that went all the way around and there was either a fold or a seam sewn up at the centre back, then you could do what we're going to do to the shoulders here and anchor the facing to the seam allowances. So you can either do this by hand or on the sewing machine. I tend to like to pin through, and generally I prefer to do this by hand. I will fold my facing back and do a figure of 8 tack to tack the seam allowances and the facing together, and it just holds it in place so that it can't move. Now I'm going to show you how to attach the facing onto the seam allowances by hand. So I've got a needle and thread here. I tend to like to put my pin in onto my facing, but leaving about 3/8 a centimetre from the edge, because I'm going to roll that back. And this is so that you can't actually see the hand stitching that we're doing. I'm going to sew in and out a couple of times or tie a knot, whatever works best for you, just to secure your stitching. And you can do this with a single or double thread, whatever works best. It's simply a case of holding the facing down, and it doesn't really have any strength properties. So I'm going to be working from the edge of the facing onto the seam allowance, and I'm going to go in and out of the seam allowance there. Now I'm going to come back onto the facing, in and out, and I'm really catching the seam allowance of the facing here, so again it's not visible from the front of the facing, and we'll pull that through. And then we're going to do the same again, going across, in and out of the shoulder seam allowance, and back in and out of the facing seam allowance. And you only really need to do this a couple of times. It will be secure just with a couple of these. You can then stitch over yourself, tie a knot to finish off. Now that will be suitable on this seam allowance here. You're welcome to do it on any other seam allowances where you can attach your facing down. If you want to do this on the sewing machine, you're going to need to go through the front of the facing and attach it to the seam allowance. Make sure that you don't go through to the right side of your garment. And just do a little backwards and forward stitch just to hold it on. And here's the sharp V-neck facing that we were aiming to achieve, with a really nice finish to the front of that V.